Ladies and gentlemen, I have a complete honor and delight to speak with Michel Bauwens today. I always love the opportunity, and we'll be continuing our series, thinking through his work and peer-to-peer and all of these things that I think today we really have to take seriously if we're going to take our moment seriously. And Michel Bauwens is an extraordinary scholar on topics of the utmost importance. So, Mr. Bowens, I really wonderful to have you here. You have had you've had a trip to China. You've been traveling. I sometimes make it to the grocery store down the street, so I
Yeah.
salute you. And you've had some wonderful experiences. And you released a Substack that highlighted some moments from your journey. But just to start, I'd love to hear about your experience.
Right. So maybe I can start a bit, how I got there first, right? So I live in Chiang Mai, northern Thailand, and there is an organization here, a network nation that's called Four Seas. I think it's the Four Seas that you find in East Asia, Southeast Asia. Um, and so they're a network nation. So what does it mean is, it's meant for Chinese diaspora, actually for Chinese in and outside China that are doing Ethereum development. And so you buy what's called an NFT. Let's not go into the details what that is, but and so then you get onboarded and you're part of the family. So and they have two physical locations in Chiang Mai, one in the city, one in the countryside, and then they have a DAO, a distributed autonomous organization. Again, for people who don't know what it is, it's like a digital version, like a digital co-op in a way, in which you can mutualize your money and then decide collectively how to spend your funds. And they use things like quadratic funding so that, the first share is one vote, but then you need 2, 4, 9, 16 shares to get extra votes. So it kind of redistributes to the small shareholder, but also by working, you get also tokens. So, capital and work are kind of kept in balance in terms of decision making. So it's quite a nifty way to think about, digital cooperation um, and they fund part of my work, and then they have a community. It's called Uncommons, and so Uncommons is on Telegram and in the social media, and basically they funded and helped me organize that trip. And they have like 500 people in China, maybe 500 outside, uh, okay, so it was 5 weeks from the end of October to early December. I did everything with the train, including locally. So Chiang Mai, Bangkok, Vientiane, the cap. I don't know if it's the capital, but the big city in Laos, and Laos Kunming, and Kunming is a big city of 8 million people in southern China. In the kind of region that's very similar to Chiang Mai. You probably maybe heard about Zumia, which is a book by James Scott called The Art of Not Being Governed. And he shows how these mountain people, basically stayed very independent from state control until more or less World War II. Now, unfortunately, there's too much technology to be able to do that in the longer term. But at that time, by not planting, obvious things that could be countered by the state bureaucracy. So instead of rice and grain, they do things that, root vegetables like carrots and green, sweet potatoes and stuff like that, right? So you can't see it, you can't count it, you can't tax it, you can't control it. Anyway, so it's part of this region. So okay, so that's the kind of context. Maybe I should also tell you that I've been to a fairly big and important trip to China maybe 15 years ago. And I want to mention that both because I had a different perspective back then, but also because I've seen quite remarkable changes in the culture. So remind me that I don't forget to talk about that, how actually people behave. Um, so 15 years ago, when I say 15, and I can't really remember exactly, it was before 2013. because Xi Jinping was not yet in power. I was invited by, basically the people around Bo Xilai, who was the governor of Shanghai, which is, like a self-running, like metropolitan area. It has its own autonomy, so it's both governor and mayor at the same time. And it was all about distributed manufacturing. At the time we had WikiSpeed, Local Motors, WikiFactory, which was actually based in China. So the whole idea of having these distributed factories working together with these open source design communities that are global, right? And apparently, some people in the government or in the party were interested in this option back then. But of course, it was a very top down uh, environment. So I was in the state compound in Beijing, stayed, in the villa of Madame Mao for a while. When we went out, we had a group. There were like 700 policemen, clearing the streets for us. We felt very important. But, when we spoke about my ideas to, like these party officials, it was like blank. Didn't clearly, like there was something that didn't travel well between, well, the way I was thinking and the way that they were still thinking. And yeah, so when Jinping came to power, Bo Xilai was put on the side, and so the whole thing eventually got derailed. But it was an experience. I went to Chengdu, to Suzhou, Hangzhou, and some other places I forgot the names by now. But I was impressed. And just maybe to give you an example, as a European, we have very convivial cities, I feel, in Europe, Ghent, Bruges, Florence, small medieval streets, uh, I was negatively shocked by these rows and rows of similar looking skyscrapers, like sometimes for 5 or 10 kilometers, it looks the same. And I said, oh God, how can you do this? Like, it's like just shoving people like sardines in a, but then I stayed for like 5, 6 days in one of these complexes. And I have to say, it's not what you think. Like they have everything. They have schools, they have banks, they have barbers, they have green walkways. So these are actually integrated neighborhoods, fractally reproduced, right?
Mm.
And then, of course, the high density model means that when you're on the ground level, there's always a lot of life and a lot of people. Maybe less in the day when people are working, but once 5 p.m., it's amazing. The lights are on. There's like a million vendors on the street, some making food for everyone. They're doing Tai Chi, they're dancing, they're like, so I had to change my mind that, this is not like the skyscrapers in outside of Paris where you have nothing and they don't have jobs. This is different. So, I had to adjust my prejudices. Okay, so this second trip, of course, was entirely different, right? It's organized by a network, and I exclusively visiting grassroots communities. And so the first one was in Kunming. It's a permaculture eco village. It's not a half an hour from Kunming, which is 8 million people, in the but surrounded by mountains, very similar to Chiang Mai, which is also surrounded by these mountain tribes. And so a village with 2 indigenous tribes, but also these people doing these alternative things, right? And permaculture, there's a lesbian couple making vegan pizzas. There's a carpenter, but they support each other in this, And so the first remark is that precisely because the Chinese system doesn't really like self-organized civil society, It wants the party to be like the intermediary, representing the people. It means that they have to be very peer-to-peer.
Mm.
That's what they told me. Like, we don't want leaders, because if we have leaders and they don't like what we do, they can be targeted more easily. So they also have two phones, the Western phone and a Chinese phone. So a phone to actually access, and that I have to say that they know everything. Like, the idea that there is a firewall against China, around China, that they don't know what's happening in the world, like, forget about it. Of course, they kind of influence maybe about Tibet and the Uyghurs. They're going to have a more nationalistic attitude. Even those people in the alternative world would be more influenced by that. But so generally speaking, very well informed. And I spoke with professors that said, yeah, American professors, they said, we feel more free in China than we do in the US right now, because we're more relaxed. We know there are red lines. We're not critiquing the party or the people in the party, but you can discuss everything. You can say there's too much pollution, the air is not good. Those things are possible. And one of the people that was traveling with me, he was always talking about the dictatorship, but he was saying that out loud everywhere in every train. And that's like, isn't that kind of weird, right? Where that he can say that and he feel relaxed about saying it. So okay. So another thing I want to say is that the first time I went to China, I found it very brutal. The way the guards were shouting at people, but also, like, I was hit in the shoulder like every other day. Like, like people just like not paying attention to other people. You know, that's what I mean with brutal. They're like,
Got it.
just charging ahead. A lot of encounters with these, electronic motorcycles, because they even close their motor to save on energy, and then they don't warn you. And so I found, you know, at that time I found, the culture is a bit rough here, right? Completely different impression this time. So I'm anticipating another place I visited. It's a mountain village, 1 hour and a half from any railway station, like really isolated. They have an how you call it, overcast gallery, with a roof. They're selling expensive uh, handicrafts. Nobody is attending the stores. Just Alibaba, or what was the other one? There's two payment, Alipay, two QR codes on the wall next to the stuff. You take the thing that you want, you pay for it. But the thing is, how can they trust tourists that they don't know? So, in terms of civic consciousness, I think China has made extraordinary strides. Nobody hit me on the shoulder this time. Nobody. And also, for example, I had some prejudices about, families having been destroyed by the Cultural Revolution, and no, all the people that I was around with, very family oriented, visiting their aunts and their uncles. I visited these clan houses as well. So I think something happened in China, even in terms of like civic consciousness. So yeah, first visit Kunming. Then the second one was Chongqing, or was it Wuhan? I forgot the right order. So in Chongqing, yeah, that was the next one. I visited um, a co-living network. It's called 706, and these are usually students from other regions. They can feel lonely because they have to go to the cities to study, and then they just co-locate with each other. But it's like a movement. and they organize 1,000 cultural events every year privately outside of the party. Just they are autonomous cultural movement, dedicated to living together, making collective decisions. And when you talk to them, I visited more than one. In some regions they get support, in some regions they're neutral, in some regions the local administration doesn't like them. So it's China is also very regional, right? It has a lot of regional variation in how even the party looks at things. Same thing with the eco villages, supported here, not supported there. So there's like quite a bit of variation. So Chongqing, if you recommend people who don't know the name yet, 30, 40 million people. It's a mountain city. It's absolutely amazing. The architecture, it's a city with many, many different levels. You're on a square, and then you realize you're on the 28th floor. Like it's a huge square, bigger than the Grand Place in Brussels. It's like huge. And yet you're not in the ground floor, you're actually on 4 different floors depending on where you take, to what side you go to, because it's the whole city is anyway. So it's quite popular. They had 1.5 million visitors last year. Then in Wuhan, which is where AIDS broke out, right? I went to see Xidao, which is the largest DAO in China. And they have also a very nice European quarter there, like a bit like Shanghai, the Bund. Very nice to visit, very convivial. And the same kind of remark. Crypto is kind of illegal in China, especially you can't speculate at all. Precisely because of that, they're using crypto for really useful things. So they have this alternative currency thing going, where they have like 1 million rice coins as collateral, and then 7 million extra rice coins because they have the collateral, and it's circulating in 20 different nodes. And they show me on the computer the exchange and the dialogue. This thing was alive. This thing was working, right? So it's kind of a paradox, right? Precisely because things are constrained, you see Chinese people doing really interesting things. So, the idea that there's no peer-to-peer in these authoritarian countries, like, no. And here, maybe I can make a general remark, So if you look at the model used by Shenzhen, the beginning, 79, it's called Shanzai or Gongkai. I'm not sure the exact difference between those two words, but it's open source, right? All these companies share their designs together. At least if you speak the same language. I think it's Tokian or Hokkien. I forgot what they speak, a particular kind of Chinese, and they're competitive like in selling stuff, but they're not competitive in keeping their ideas for themselves. Yeah, and so I think we shouldn't underestimate the role that has played in the success of China. That they didn't have these, IP restrictions. That they just, innovation just, is shared very, very quickly in these whole networks. And maybe I can make some general remarks here if you don't mind. This is kind of what Michael Hudson thinks as well, who is, he has several books. One is called The Destiny of Civilization, right? And his thesis is that basically the West has become a rentier capitalism where, money is made through speculative investments. And so we don't build anymore. We don't have industry anymore. We sell music rights and film rights, and we have to pay interest rates and high rent and all that stuff. But we don't actually build stuff anymore, right? And we're impoverishing ourselves doing that. And then China is an industrial society. They are actually building. And so let me give you a little kind of timeline. So when Xi Jinping comes to power in 2013, his first lecture is about nihilism. Like he says, the reason the Soviet Union fell is because the party did no longer believe in its own ideas. And he says, power without principle gets corrupted. And we can't have that in China, right? So then he created this double priority, common prosperity and ecological civilization. This is very important because, before Jinping, Communist Party officials were only judged on their capacity to advance GDP. And, that was successful in some ways, making buildings, making skyscrapers, bridges, trains, it's all good for GDP. And of course, doing that, they created this amazing infrastructure. But now common prosperity is actually redefined specifically as ending poverty in 10 years. And they're sending 4 officials to every village with the explicit aim of ending poverty in that village, with quite a lot of power to make individual decisions or even individual people. And then the other thing is ecological civilization, which means you are now judged not just on GDP and common prosperity, also judged on ecological progress, right? So that's why, like now you go to Beijing and it's clean. The air is clear. The sky is blue. And they have this forest around the city that absorbs, and they move some factories and all the motorcycles everywhere I went now were electric, all of them. I think I saw one motorcycle that was on gas. In the 9 cities I visited, one. Everybody has electric motorcycles. Of course, you have to produce the electricity, but within the cities, that changes a lot. Yeah. Without cars in the city, the air is much, much cleaner. And so in that sense, this is my analysis. I think China, and of course it's distorted by authoritarianism, by, maybe like a specific class configuration that they have, but it has a common good orientation. I really believe this is that they're thinking about China as a whole over the long term, and they're thinking about the people and making the country more prosperous. It's not a merchant class that runs the country for its own benefit. They're not predatory on their own people. And I think that's true. That's, and I may get accused of being too pro-Chinese because I see this, but that's what I see. And, I'm desperate about Europe and the US especially because, where's the common good? Like, what can you do that's good for the people? Because the private interests are too big and democracy is not functioning because that's not where the decisions are being made. And so I look at China, in that context as a bit as the crown of modernity. Because what they've done is the planning mechanism of the state, 40 million people that produce a 5-year plan every 5 years. First bottom up, then adjudication centrally, and then of course it's implemented. Markets, but the markets are very competitive, not rentier based, and they don't have the power over the state. So you can maximum 3% of the people in the party can be owners of capital, right? The land remains managed by the villages, can only be leased, not sold. They have a Proudhonian banking system where the rule is everybody who wants to do something productive has to be able to get a loan, right? So a lot of small enterprise like making food and all kinds of things, not just the big so market dynamics, very competitive. So in that sense, they're like even more capitalist than we are, because they really have to And also it means that everything is cheap, and it's no longer just labor, because labor is now already 20 times more expensive than it was 20 years ago. So it's not just that labor is cheap, you know, it's the whole system allows for this cheap production. And then, of course, cybernetic threshold management, you know. And of course, technically, we can do that in the West, but we only use it internally within Walmart and the big, and BlackRock. It's not used for the common good. It's used to get our data and to sell our attention, but it's not used to manage the country, in a way that benefits more people. And so this is the positive side. The negative side is that I don't believe that China, is ecological enough. They're still in overshoot. They're still, producing enormous amounts of carbon. They're still poisoning lakes. Although, they're using their surplus to actually do a lot on the other side, right? They're greening deserts. They're doing a lot of good stuff. And that's why, that's what my work is about. I still think we need a third option, which is to directly organize regenerative productive communities. But that's for another time. I'm just saying that so this is how I see China. Okay, so I said Wuhan, Shanghai, make actually more universities there, like really advanced, crypto labs and stuff, like amazing. Like if you want to check it out, Helena Rong, young woman, but like what they're writing, I don't find that in New York. Like really advanced technological stuff. Maybe I should say, so I'm in this village again, the same village. I'll 1 hour and a half from the train station, and at 7 a.m. I'm waking up with Zoom. Zoom or open the window. There's 20 drones in the sky. Tourist drones. Drones have become like a tourist thing, to make pictures and movies when you travel, right? Then there is a bakery in this village, again in the middle of nowhere, and it's a couple making croissants, the amazing French croissants. They went to Paris to learn, opened a bakery in Shanghai, got tired of the city, and okay. My coffee is brought by a robot, a dog robot with a hole in his back, right? 1/3 of the cars that I went in were electric. So I think there's, I don't know the figures, but I have a really high density now of electric cars everywhere, like in every single city I went to. And in the countryside, they have these electric tuk-tuks. They only cost like $1,500. So a lot of farmers have them, to move things, by themselves. Yeah, then in Shenzhen you have these flying taxis. Like where in the West do we see this? And drone delivery of food right on the corner of the streets with a dedicated machines. They don't come to your home, but so yeah, okay. And then I went to these 3 villages, and I want to say a bit more about that. So there is a movement in China. It's called the National Rural Reconstruction Movement, and they're revitalizing villages. Not exactly farming necessarily, but bringing artisans and artists and refurbishing the old houses, attracting people to come there, and they have trained 15 volunteers that eventually also want to settle in these villages. And they make the villages look really nice, full of nice little stores, and then the tourists come and the whole rural economy. And this is also something maybe important, is that when Jinping rewrote the rules of the real estate business, it was not an accident, right? It was designed to end the urbanization process, because they already had 75 million empty apartments. And so the way to look at this is that they use the surplus of the countryside to build up the urbanization, but now that they reach that level, now they're doing the opposite. So it's not just
Mm.
these alternative movements, it's something that the party and the Chinese state is also doing, which is like going inland and trying to revive, the countryside. Um, so yeah, so three villages that I visited like that, really interesting. And then I ended with Shenzhen and then Hong Kong. And I have my book translated in two alphabets, the Mandarin and Classic Chinese, and it was number two on the ebook uh, top 10, in Hong Kong, because it's not an official book. It's actually a samizdat edition. Um, and so my book can only be sold in Hong Kong electronically. But everyone I met, when I gave lectures in different places, they knew about it. They had access to it, right? So yeah, I was very impressed. And I think, you know, as a world civilization, I do think we are in a declining overshoot situation. But within that, there is a upward movement of China, which is then the attractor for Russia, for India, for a lot of people in the BRICS and the global South, where they start thinking, now it's our turn because the West can no longer stop our development. Which is what we did through neoliberalism and through lending, is force these countries to destroy their state apparatus and pay back the debts and created mass migration and all the stuff that happened in the last 40 years. And now there is this hope that some of what China has achieved can be done elsewhere. Yeah, give me a minute to drink something, and maybe you
You take
can.
your time. I could listen to you absolutely all day. Well, that was absolutely marvelous. I was in China, well, like 10, 15, 15, maybe we were there at the same time. Actually just didn't cross, actually.
Yeah.
And it's funny because at that time, the air pollution in Beijing was so bad, you couldn't go outside. They had screens where you could watch the sun because you couldn't see it through the clouds. And I remember, and you mentioned the trains, we took a train to Nanjing, and I remember, and it's going so fast, and just fields and fields of apartments just going on forever and ever. And I really appreciated what you were noting about this very alive cultural capital, social space at the bottom of the apartments that form that are so alive. And to me, when you're mentioning the common good, it's very interesting because there's something about that term that I think can be hard for the Westerner to think because it is hard for us to think environments. It is hard for us to think architecture. We think formulas and problems. But to me, when people have to believe there is a common good, and one of the ways they believe that not just say there's a common good, like freedom or patriotism or equality or something, but actually go outside and experience it. And when you talk about people having vendors, because I was teaching at a school in Guanyuan, and I always remember going outside at night, and there was a guy doing tricks with a pole that was on fire. There were vendors like, where'd all these people come from? It's like there's a festival on a Tuesday night for some reason. Yeah, that's just kind of the vibrancy even of that Guanyuan, and I remember that vividly. And the closest thing I have that in America is going up to Roanoke at Christmas time, where the whole community comes together and puts together these festivals. But those are very rare. That kind of thing doesn't occur. Usually, when you go to the downtown in America or Linz or somewhere, it's kind of dead. Everything is in the shops. You have to go into the shop, and it's very isolated. But when you get an environment like Roanoke at Christmas time, or stepping outside in Guanyuan, where it's like alive, that is the emotional and lived experience that makes it plausible to you that there even is a common good, that such language is meaningful. And it's very interesting, as you were speaking, there's just more and more of this idea that China has focused on increasing the probability of experiences like that for the average person. Because what is the relationship between the city and the countryside? What are the chances that when you see a city, you go, wow, like, look at the design. Like, aesthetic experiences like that, architectural
Yeah.
experiences go a long way to making you go, somebody cares. somebody cares. Someone is thinking about this, right? Someone is conscious of how things are being built. So you're in your aesthetics, you're having a feeling that there's a common good. Going outside your apartment, there's people gathered, so there's a common good. And I think what I was just thinking as you were speaking is that governments have not prioritized the common good and making sure it's not merely a philosophical premise, but something that you can live, experience, and feel. It makes me think. The living architecture that that gentleman was speaking, Venice, talking about that and how we went into brutalism in the 70s and kind of lost all of that. And it's interesting also what you're saying about China going into urbanization, but then coming out of it, right? Kind of moving now in the other direction. And perhaps that is the necessary way things have to go in order to end up getting something that's more of a technologically advanced living architecture versus a living architecture that emerges where there isn't technological advancement, right? That seems to be the big challenge. How can you have technological advancement without losing the common good? Well, it seems to me that you have to be thinking much more spatially, architecturally. What is it like to go outside and see things? And I have in mind, as I say all of this, there's a history of thinkers in social theory, Pierre Bourdieu, for example, in Distinctions or different people. And what they point out, like what he points out in the book Distinctions, is that many times class divisions are aesthetically reified. So, for example, I middle class people wear blue jeans and drive trucks, and they look a certain way. There's a kind of music they listen to, right? And when I look over at a rich person or someone who's in a different class, they're going to be driving a Tesla, and they're not going to be listening to country music. They're going to be listening to NPR. There's a certain experience of that person that says to
Yeah.
me, they're better than me. I have nothing to do with them, right? And the thing that Bourdieu is pointing to is that a civilization that is not aware is not aware of this problem is going to inevitably fall into aesthetics. And by aesthetics, it's also not just looking at a painting. It's like the way the world presents itself to you and you see things. There's always subconscious associations being made that put people in this box and you in this box and this box. When that occurs, you don't have a common good. There's lots of little goods that everyone are locked into their little box to do. So you have to be very aware in terms of design, in terms of like how are things are done so that people don't their experience of the world is not constantly reifying divisions and separations. And when you have the experience of going outside your apartment or going to Roanoke and the bankers are come together with the shops people and there's vendors everywhere, then you go, oh, that's an aesthetic experience. That's something you experience that says to you there's a common good. And as we know famously in America, Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone, there's been increasingly a loss of the social capital. And it is, and very often
And
people,
so I think they also lost it at some point in their development in China,
and they
and
got
then
it back.
they got it back because they actually have an instrument to think about it, you know. And I also think, you know, until the time that Europe was still social democratic, we had a common good. You know, it was imposed by the strength of the social and the labor and the green movement. But then under neoliberalism, when capital became translocal, it became stronger and it started, destroying all these little by little. All these things started disappearing. And I think in China they also probably had a period like that in the 90s where everything was like working, buying, but they somehow came back from it. And so I want to just give you an anecdote. So when I went the first time, I was invited by these mayors and governors and stuff. And so there was this one mayor from, I forgot the name of the city, but we had 17 tables, right? So he started by doing kanbei, like drink a toast, and then you hit the table and then you drink it in one go, right? So he did 3 toasts, and then he went to every table. So he had basically 20 glasses before even starting to eat, right?
Nice.
And I remember I was shocked seeing that because he was obviously drunk. at some point. And then I remember, reading that at the time, the party officials, they died like on average 155 in the provinces because they had this insane lifestyle. When they have this 2-3 times a week, right? It's part of their job to entertain people. And they would drink wine and alcohol, and they had these expensive watches for their status, and that's gone. There's still rich officials and less rich officials, I'm guessing, but they can't show it off anymore like that, because that's one of the changes that came, with Jinping, is like no more alcohol in these official events. And you're not supposed to be showing off certain things, because you are the service of the people and you shouldn't make them jealous. So there is something. I don't know anything about his personal lifestyle, but I wouldn't be surprised if he's relatively ascetic himself. Because if you know his past, he was persecuted in the Cultural Revolution. I mean, his father was. So I'm not trying to paint the rosy picture, because of course stuff is happening there around power, and but that doesn't mean that they're all bad in everything they do. They can have aspects that are interesting and positive. Um, on the other side, they are creating, because of their success, this is the paradox, a new layer of young people who are having the same problems as we had in the West in the 60s. Like, why are we working so hard? What's the meaning of life? Should we be working 9 hours a day, 6 days, because the Chinese work very hard, and then they spend 2 hours or more in excellent public transportation. But there's a lot of people who work very hard, and like now there's but it's a paradox, because things are going well that they are starting to ask these questions, right? So they are getting into a stage where they get more and more of these cultural dissatisfaction at the level of young generations. But they're also fighting a cultural fight, like maximum 3 hours of internet for young people, closing down private mentorship companies because it created too much inequality between the middle class and others. So now you can only do NGO mentorship, to learn the language, learn English and stuff. Interventions, even narrative level, like you can no longer have stories where a poor girl meets a billionaire and gets saved, because 40% of young girls think they will find a billionaire after seeing a few of these programs. So this is what I mean with cybernetic threshold management.
Right.
They pay attention to everything, and of course it can be experienced as oppressive. Certainly, and I remember going to a library and I looked to the Financial Times and they had cut 2 pages out of it. Right? That I don't like that. I think people should be free to learn and read. So there is a management of these things in China, which, um, but I feel that, my experience, what's happening in Europe is, yeah, we're going in the same direction. Like in the UK, they arrest 30 people per day on opinion, things, more than Russia. They arrest more people in the UK than in Russia. Like, this is unimaginable, right? And then now you have 56 people like Jacques Beau that are sanctioned by the EU. Administratively, there's no legal procedure to do that. It's like a decision top down, and they're debanked. They can't buy food because they want peace, in Ukraine, or so yeah. So I find that frustrating because, I'm very attached to freedom of speech. When people critique liberalism, yeah, sure, but the rights, you know, and of course, I believe, because I'm a former socialist, that actually the labor movement was very important in actually achieving these rights, right? Because democracy, yeah, but who could vote 200 years ago? Only people with land, and for children, and they had these rules. It was only for the property class, right? So our democracies is only really a 20th century phenomenon, but we did have, a lot more speech freedoms, right? And we are losing it, and that's a tragedy.
Again, I could listen to you all day because I think this is getting at the heart of the major tensions we have to think today, because there seems to be trade-offs. And the question is, um, what are the benefits of free speech if it ultimately leads to a world when you go outside the basement of the first floor of the apartment and nobody's there, right? What
Right.
value is, say, diversity? Because obviously, China has a less diverse society generally than the West, right? But you see, one of the great tensions is diversity and in a belief in a common good are in conflict. Because if you have diversity, people don't agree on what is the good, right? And so you get all of those problems, right? And basically, if the West is going to support things that are more on the side of free speech, diversity, and so on, well, where's the fruit? What is the fruit, right? Because
Yeah.
increasingly, people in the West are like, well, maybe this social contract isn't worth it. Maybe it's, and that's where you get the Lands and the Dugan and people saying liberalism is a failed project, and they're going in the
Yeah.
other direction. And a lot of people are saying they seem to have a point. They seem
Yeah,
to
but
have a
I,
point.
I think it proceeds from, this new power structure where, so, and this is Karatani as well, right? He says capital state nation was the compromise after the religious, Reformation and the civil wars around religion, where, capital is primary, but then you have the state and the nation can influence the state. And so, what Polanyi calls the lib lab, 30 years of liberalizing, 30 years of re-regulation, either, freeing the market from society or freeing society for the market, this kind of tension. And it worked until the 1980s. And then in the 1980s, capital became transnational. And so it's not a crisis of democracy. It's because democracy has nothing to decide. That's the problem. We can't decide. There's no power at that level. And so, in my approach, right, I say what we have to do is create structures at the level of that transfinancial capital,
Yes.
transnational capital, which is we have to create commons federations, cosmolocal commons federations, archipelago of regenerative projects that create new identities and collaborate translocally to have counterpower at the level where the power is, right? And this is where, my vision of Europe is, what they should do, in my view, if I had the power, is, okay, they're not going to succeed in reindustrializing on the model of China. Like, we can't do it. We don't have the cheap labor. We don't have the, but what we could do is distributed manufacturing, right? A new model of reindustrialization that is based on the high tech and on the open designs, and on biodegradable material and on the blue economy, like that. We call it regenerative accelerationism, right? Instead of this kind of nihilistic accelerationism of Nick Land and all of these people. Now, I think it's not going to happen because nothing in the political division that we have, there's no forces that are doing it. So I think Europe is becoming, and probably the US is becoming, the exit strategy, right? It's people because they're technically savvy, highly educated, they have these green ideals, is that, and it's less needed in China because they're still functioning so well at the modernity level. But because we don't work well at that modernity level, I think Europe and the US, the civil society can play a role in being the shining beacons of this exit strategy around the commons. It's my hope. So I do believe, that's where the hope is, that we, so I'll give you an example. I'm invited in Normandy, La République autonome du Bocage. And, so these mayors are interested in attracting young people. So 150 young people, got like leases, cheap leases, and they install themselves in Normandy. And every year they're organizing a science fiction festival in the middle of nowhere, right? Mm. But for me, that represents something. These communities that my own daughter is going to La Creuse, which is right in the middle of the poorest district. It's like Bavaria or the Ardennes, very wooded. And she bought a house in a village, 15,000 euro instead of 500,000 in Paris. And this is a village where the last person died in the late 90s, and there are now 70 people there. Right? So this is happening, I'm not saying at massive scale, but more than you think. People are moving to smaller cities, to the countryside, and are creating. So the number of eco villages went up with 10, from 150 to 1,500 in France in 10 years. So for me that's significant that this is happening, right? So yeah, so going to China helped me also to think about the differences and yeah, the mentalities are different because the European population has experienced 30 years of stagnation of wages, high migration pressure, loss of cultural identity and self-confidence. But if you look at Asia, they had 30 years of growth. Right. Thailand, Vietnam, China. So they have issues because of that growth, and it's slowing down in many places. But they have not the same experience. Their consciousness is different because they still believe in development, whereas a lot of people in Europe have lost it. They're doomsters.
Yes.
Especially on the left, they're doomsters, right? And I think this is another key issue that we have to look at, is that once 1989 and the really existing socialist countries collapsed, the left lost its positive outlook on the future and became a conservative force, with exit dreams of degrowth. And the reaction to it in the populist right is to ignore all these issues and say, yeah, we'll go to Mars and we'll solve everything through technology. But they're just ignoring the challenges, right? So it's like magical thinking. And I think we have to reinvent, like extropic thinking, with the belief in the future and the emancipation of mankind. In that way, I'm very old-fashioned. I believe we're better than this.
That's getting at everything. That's like exactly what we have to think at this moment. So there's a few things. First off, there comes to be some sort of tendency for people to no longer believe in development. And it can start to occur when the younger generation actually is asking, what's the point? So you get the success, then you get the what's the point? And the critical thing that I'll expand on is this is the moment when we have not trained people by which to actually use thinking properly, and thinking can always deconstruct. because you can always ask why, and you can never establish a first principle rationally. It has to be non-rationally. But we have not had an education system or a social coordination system by which, when the young person problem emerges, like you're saying is happening in China, this historically occurs, there hasn't been an infrastructure to take those questions and actually guide them towards seeing them not in light of the prosperity, to see in the prosperity and the transformations of the society as being meaningful. We have not, in a sense, we have not had education function to deal with that problem. It's been done to make you able to participate well, engineer, to participate in the prosperity, but it has not been focused on why care about the prosperity, if you will, why find it meaningful. And the issue is, if you don't do that, that's going to go back. You're going to end up back in nihilism. You can talk about the problems of nihilism all day long, but it will always go back into it, and then it doesn't sustain itself. So we have not focused on this problem, and one of the reasons I'm extremely bullish about this Zoom YouTube technology is because this allows an educational renaissance that's lifelong, where people can ask the big questions and they can find people to talk about them with. So here's another issue. Free speech without this technology has ended up simply being personal expression. The point of free speech should be for ultimately philosophical conversation. And you see, we haven't had the infrastructure to do it. So let's say you're a random kid who lives in Rustburg, Virginia, and you're interested in big questions. What are the chances of you finding people to talk about it with? Because most of the people around you are probably not reading Hegel. And if they were interested in it, they've repressed it because they've been led to feel like it's a waste of time or they're not going to get paid for it, right? There hasn't been a social infrastructure that has allowed people to coordinate finding people to speak with so they can ask those big questions and not feel like it's a because here's the issue. If you can't find people to talk about it with, all that prosperity will feel like a repression keeping those questions out. And you'll eventually blow up. You'll eventually explode or say, no, I don't see the point of working. Please.
So this is what I see actually what China is attempting to do as well, right? Is they see the enemy of the West, and it is the moral disintegration of the West. And it's actually literal. What Dugin did with Putin. There's a Chinese guy, I just forgot his name, but he's now actually in the Politburo, and he specifically pointed at wokeness as a sign of disintegration of Western civilization, right? Mm. So what the Chinese are doing under Jinping is a new synthesis of their Marxism, the signified Marxism, Marx, Mao, Deng, Jinping, and like their version of it, and I think that at least some people actually believe in that. I don't think it's purely instrumental, just as you have people in Catholic Church who still believe, and some don't, but a lot of people actually do. And then the second thing is the civilization state, right? So Confucian institutes almost everywhere, where Chinese people are relearning their civilizational background. And I read an article where they were saying they translated 300 books from European conservative thought. Leo Strauss and people like that. And so why are they doing this? It's stormbreakers, right? They know modernity has these issues. Even in China, they're not immune to those things, and in some ways they can be worse off because we in the West, we have a critical tradition, right? We had the labor movement, we had the green movement, and a lot of people in Asia, they're just like blindly consumerist,
right?
And then they have their old style religion, or they have this kind of Marxism that they can have in China, but they're not necessarily better equipped to face these issues. But what they're doing is they're slowing it down, right? They put these stormbreakers, and I think that's a clever strategy. We need more time to adapt because the pace at which things are moving, it's like. And I think that's the fault of neoliberalism, is that some things can change if you have another place where you can stay stable. But if everything is changing at the same time, like
Right.
I don't think your nervous system
No.
can cope with this very well, right? And that is, like, you see the mental health, and a study came out last week that it's as high in Asia as in the US. So the smartphone has done just as much damage to young people, in Asia and in China. So they're facing, but they're doing something about it. And the problem I think we have in the US, for example, is as long as it's making money, who cares, right?
Exactly.
But of course, you do have reactions like Jonathan Haidt. He's having a lot of success in stopping smartphones from schools, and I'm with him on that. I think it's such a tragedy that young people, because you say we should have these reading and conversation clubs, but they're not reading, right? It's where literacy is literally going down, which is demographic collapse and literacy collapse are two of the main signs of civilizational collapse.
Yeah.
And we're in the middle of it.
No, I agree with all that. So there's a bunch of things. So outstanding. So part of the issue as well is we're giving kids a smartphone, but we're not giving them a culture or a use of the smartphone that would have them want to read Leo Strauss or The Three Kingdoms or want them to engage in ideas. They don't even know they're allowed to do that because they're led to feel as if those questions are a waste of time unless you pay money, right? When in fact, those questions, and this is my giant claim, those kind of meaning questions are trust questions. Because if you can't tell me what is the point of working 9 hours a day, I no longer trust I'm using my time well to do it, right? And there's a long-standing problem where development destroys trust. When you would think that development would increase trust because things are getting better, but it destroys trust. And then you lose the people gathered outside the apartment, having the vendors, you lose the social good, you lose all of that. So why is it development destroys trust? Because, basically, just as a kind of simple thing, I sometimes kind of think about the common good problem as the book bag test. And what I mean by that is, whether it's true or not, you hear this all the time, where young kids can, in Japan, get off the train, leave their book bags at the train station, and come back hours later and they're still there, right? Or you can leave your laptop on a table and come back and no one's touched it. So that's a high trust society. If you do not live in a society where you can do that or see it aesthetically being done, you will not believe in the common good. You may say you do, but you emotionally will not, and you will allocate your time not to prioritize it because you don't see it, and then you get a negative feedback loop, right? So you have to have the Japanese school children backpack test. If you fail that, you don't have the common good. But here's the issue: no society means to fail that. Everyone tries to pass that test, but it kind of fades away. So the question becomes, why? I think it's because we basically never pass the why, the test of being able to justify metaphysically in terms of why. It's when the young generation, you have the development arises and the young kids begin asking why, and why make the sacrifices for that development, because eventually the problem is you run into psychoanalytical issues where objects of desire don't fulfill you. You're working really hard and you don't know why. You don't have an identity. You start being hit by these philosophical questions. And here's the key: philosophical questions are mental health questions. If you cannot answer philosophical questions or metaphysical questions, your mental health begins to deteriorate because you are trying to hold yourself together in a fragmented way or a repressive way, or you're trying to forget those questions that bother you.
Agree. Yeah, I had a lot of issues when I was young, and I really discovered that narrative. Yeah, your life is a narrative. And a good therapy is changing your narrative in a way
100%.
that's coherent and that allows you to move forward.
That's right.
And it's kind of ridiculous, but there's this study in France, over a very long term, about life expectancy, and who lives the longest? The philosophy professors of the Sorbonne. Mind over matter, 100%. People who do professional sports die first, like
Yes,
in
they
the
do.
late 50s.
Sure.
Workers die 2-3 years after their pension. White collar employees maybe 10 years after the pension, and and it's really the use of the mind and your capacity to project yourself and to have projects, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. So this is just an anecdote, but during COVID, like I was used to travel and talk to people, and now I'm like, and China was crazy, about COVID. It was like everything was closed, and people had masks, and they put even babies between glass houses and all kinds of stuff, because they have this hygienic fear already, and so that's when I was listening to John David Ebert, and he's a guy who's read all these books already 40 years ago, basically civilizational analysis. And I said, wow, that's what I have to do. I need something big enough, ambitious enough to have a bone to bite in, and that's what I've been doing. And I'm pretty sure now it's to the rest of my life that I'll be doing this thing, because it's a very ambitious project, and it keeps me going. Yeah.
Well, you'll live to your 90s, so that's fantastic. So,
Who
like,
knows?
and I'm really taken. Basically, I suppose the point I have a lot to think about with private property, intellectual property that you presented. That's fascinating. There are sections in Belonging again with 1,000 notes on it. I really appreciate Scott with the vegetables being underground. That's Deleuzian rhizomatic to avoid lines of capture. Basically, I think that Web 3.0, the social in this social coordination mechanisms have a rhizomatic possibility to it that can help actually address some of those matters. And I suppose the last thing I will say that I'll just say for now, and we'll have to talk again, is this key problem of the youth in not accepting the development and thus acting in a way that destroys trust. And that philosophy is tied to mental health and maintaining social trust in the development. And if you don't, and basically my gigantuous claim is that we have not in history had a social coordination mechanism in infrastructure like this to have lifelong, quote unquote, philosophical education. If you don't have that, then it's inevitable that people will lose faith in the development. They're not going to be able to explore their questions, and then the development will go into nihilism and be destroyed.
I think I think we had it right. I mean, the whole idea of the polis, the civitas. But of course, it was for an elite, right? So you have
right.
Society. You have a slave-based society or a serf-based society, and unequal property, but you have citizenship, right? And that citizenship, was focused around self-development, philosophical development.
Yes.
And in a way, even under capitalism, under liberal arts and Bildung, it was a thing. It was a thing.
Yes.
When I was young, it was still a thing. And so the idea was that, the labor movement wanted it for everybody, right? So the building movement in Scandinavia and in Belgium, in the Flanders where I lived, it used to be called, Volkshogescholen. It means popular high schools, right? You could learn everything. And the working class, they went to these places and they learned languages and they learned to read literature and they learned to analyze movies. So there was this Bildung, and I think it started disappearing again, in the late 80s, early 90s. I think this was such a toxic change that happened in Western society where, and I actually blame very specifically, commercial TV. Because as long as we had public TV, it was always about uplift. They believed that the people could learn, could be uplifted, and you can still see it if you look at Norwegian television. There's still good stuff. Or PBS 10, 15 years ago, before it became, what it is today. So we had a bit of it, and we tried to democratize it, and then it was actively destroyed. I think, for some people it was consciously. They don't want thinking people. They want, mindless consumers. But no society can live like that. It's not working.
For me, no, the Nordic Bildung is a big deal. Lena Anderson. I think there's a lot of the great question, of the great mystery, and then I know it's getting very, very late, but I think a lot about the Dietrich McCloskey Great Enrichment of the Netherlands, and I think a lot about the Bildung of the Nordic nations, because in the Nordic nations you had the well-being of average people. It goes from extremely poor to doing very well, as Lena Anderson says, and then you have this mysterious explosion of wealth that happens in the Netherlands with the Dutch Empire that has a big impact. Those two things, for some reason, end up devouring one another, and the wealth creation goes away, and the common good goes away. So the question is why? And you're exactly right. There has in history been Bildungs and the elites getting the education. It goes back kind of to Socrates and people being like, well, the only way you can do philosophy is if you don't work, because that's the only way to get time to do it. For me, the big deal with the social coordination mechanism is I, living in a rural area far away from the city, not involved with a university, can now, before going to work, have 2 hours of speaking with you in the other side of the world, the great Michel
Yeah, yeah.
Bauwens, talking about these ideas, and then I can go back to my blue collar job. And you see, the key is now true
But you have to
diversity
want
is
it. You have
possible.
to want it. That's the
You
problem,
have to
right?
want it. So what we
You have
have to
to want
do, yes, we have to want it. So the question is, what do you do to increase the conditions of possibility that the average person on the planet will want it versus not? And what would the reform of the school, and how do you increase flows? How do you direct people toward that? Those are those questions that I think about a lot. But I will stop and thank you for being here. And I look forward to speaking again.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's always great. The same as you, I could talk for hours. And yeah, so I hope that, the people get some idea of how interesting China is becoming and how fast it's evolving, and, to see it in its complexity. It's, has good sides and bad sides like everything. But right now, it has a configuration that is very powerful.
I love listening to you speak on that because again, my experience in China is from 10, 15 years ago. And yeah, everyone was drinking, the leaders were doing that at the school. Absolutely. And it's extraordinary to hear the transformations. And again, there is something about you said they have somehow regained the common good, right? That is a very critical mystery and question I think we need to examine.
Yeah.
And from my bias, I think of it with the social coordination mechanism and thinking the problems of the Netherlands and in the Nordic nations and how there's a lot there to be thought.
Yeah.
But it's a
So
pleasure to be.
but I think, and this is maybe a bit more of a Marxist side that I still have, but I think that, not letting the merchants run the country,
Mm-hmm. Right.
because democracy was always this tension between. So if you look at East Eurasia, and this is, Michael Hudson's thesis, and I really believe this, harmony seeking, harmony maintaining, centralized empires with an arbiter on top, and the Mandarins rule, but not the merchants. The merchants are in their box,
Right.
and they can have a lot of space, like in the Song Dynasty, but not the top place, right?
Right.
Similarly, in democracy, when it functions, you have this balance between oligarchy and property and political equality. The problem is that, if you look at history, the oligarchy always money ends up eating democracy. So again, just to finish with this, and then maybe there's another solution, which is if you have commons-oriented productive communities,
Right.
they're democratic by nature.
Yep. Exactly.
So it doesn't have to come from the outside with no. Like they're making these collective decisions, and so they have a practice of democracy, and because they co-own the productive forces to a certain degree, also that inequality is not the same, right?
Right.
Anyway.
No, what you were saying about what I found really fascinating is they become peer-to-peer to not have a leader precisely because that would be captured, right? Like the Chinese government would see that. I was also really taken on what you were saying about the use of crypto in a non-speculative, really useful way because you're not, which is an example of limits creating creativity and actually finding greater use. What's interesting is, again, for Dietrich McCloskey, so much of the great enrichment goes with the rise of the merchant, right? Where the merchant is elevated, where it's no longer a dirty job, there's some value to it. But the problem is, what do you do when if the merchant gets all the way to the top? You have trouble, right? There seems to
Yeah.
be, if there's no leader, you don't have to worry about that problem so much, right?
Yeah.
And of course, please.
So you know what happened in the Dutch Republic is very interesting. I forgot the name of the author. Um, so I can't remember, but it's very interesting. So his claim is that the reason the Dutch Republic failed eventually is because, you know, it was a mercantile nation, right? It was actually capital that created these provinces. And the reason it failed is that it abolished the guilds, you know, and so they want to destroy the laboring classes and their power. And because of that, when they were at war, the workers didn't want to fight.
Yep.
They
Yep.
self-destructed. You know, it was like an
Yep.
early form of neoliberalism. They self-destructed.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's E.P. Thompson or something like that. The Evan Thompson, I would have
Hmm.
to look it up. It's
California.
very
Yeah.
interesting. It's about vital institutions.
Yes.
And
Thompson. Yep. Yep.
yeah,
Um, well, that problem might be happening today in the West because if you make people, they don't care. They don't care. Well, if they don't care, you got an issue. But how do you make people care? There is a kind of historic cycle where we're not able civilizationally to maintain care. Like it eventually
yeah.
goes away. And how would you fix that? Again, I bias it with the Bildung. I think of that about. But the point I also was just going to say is what you were saying about the rise of the merchant class. You know, Tocqueville in Democracy basically says eventually democracy starts very Bildung-like. It is incredibly Bildung-like in philosophical conversation, and it eventually passes over into letting the merchant class make the decisions. I think part of the reasons from a psychoanalytical standpoint is because the merchant makes reality quantifiable. This is valuable, this is not, it's worth $20. And if I stay in the Bildung, I'm trying to think in quality, which can lead, which can be more mentally exhausting. It can require more judgment, and I have to, and facing anxiety. So there's a psychoanalytical barrier that has to be overcome. But that's why school needs to
I think,
focus.
you know, whether today whether you're left or right, it doesn't matter. If you're a manager, you're counting.
Yep. Yeah,
And
exactly.
reason has become counting. You know, how many hours, you know, what's the KPI? All these people are thinking in numbers,
Yes.
and there's no quality. And
Yes.
so the quality in my life in the last 25 years, I see the quality of everything going down. You know,
Yes.
the
Yes.
nurses are less friendly, the
Yes.
postman no longer
All
wait
go
until
down.
you come down. Everything has been like optimized, you know, into this kind of efficiency thinking. And they all think that way. They're all trained to think that way. And of course, in China also they think that way, you know, a lot. Um,
No, it's big. The final thing I'll say is you just framed the key problem is that development tends to lead to habits of quantity, which then you get a younger generation that asks, what's the point of that quantity? And we tend to go in the direction of quantity because it gives us an illusion of understanding, which is comforting. But the younger generation doesn't buy it. And basically, because we're not able to educate people into quality, we lose it. And that's what we have to fight to keep people in thinking in terms of
yeah,
quality. But I'll stop. It
okay,
is
I gotta
always a
stop
pleasure
here.
to speak
Yeah,
with you,
I
sir.
have
Thank you
other
so
things in
much.
your